On a cold day in December of 2000, a couple of deputies with Ohio's Vinton County Sheriff's Office arrived at a rural trailer property just outside the tiny community of Ray. The reason for their visit was relatively routine. They were there to serve court papers in connection with a recent theft and burglary case. No sooner had the deputies pulled up when it appeared that their visit may have been a waste of time. The place wasn't in the greatest shape, and it looked like it might have been abandoned some time ago. Unsurprisingly, there was also no answer when they knocked on the trailer's front door. However, as the officers were preparing to leave, they spotted something that caught their attention. Something that they could immediately tell just didn't fit with everything else that they had seen so far. Because of this, they decided to investigate further. Though they didn't know it yet, this would turn out to be an unbelievably important decision. By complete coincidence, they had just stumbled across a crucial piece of evidence in a case more than 100 miles away. According to everyone that knew her, it seemed obvious that Emily Murray had a bright future ahead of her. She was a gifted student, a loving friend, sibling, and daughter, and at just 20 years old, knew exactly what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. Originally from Sleepy Hollow, New York, Emily spent most of her life in Shaker Heights, Ohio. She was born into a blended family, growing up with her parents, Tom and Cynthia, as well as two sisters and a brother from the couple's previous marriages. By all accounts, it was an incredibly loving family. Emily's siblings never treated her as though there was a hyphen between the word brother or sister in their relationship, and all of them got along well together. Emily's childhood was similarly a happy one. Tom had a good job as the director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics at Case Western University, and would later go on to get his dream job at the Hastings Center, a respected and leading bioethics think tank in New York. His career allowed the family to have a comfortable life. Each year, they would vacation in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which quickly became Emily's favorite place in the world. On mornings, she liked to run out to the pier close to where they would stay as early as possible. In her words, she liked to imagine that she was the first person in the country to see the sunrise. This thoughtful and reflective attitude was apparently at the core of who Emily was from the time that she was a child. Much like her dad, she was gifted academically and also cared greatly about issues and problems facing the world. Something else that guided Emily's life from very early on was her Christian faith. She got deeply involved in the Episcopal Church, and from the time that she was a young girl also devoted a significant amount of her time to charity work. Her parents would later recall how when she was just 7 years old, she created little business cards which she handed out to adults in her neighborhood, offering to do chores. The cash she earned was never intended to be for profit. Instead, Emily gave it all to the anti-poverty organization, the United Way. In fact, Emily didn't really see the appeal of money at all. She bought most of her clothes secondhand because she didn't see the point of having fancy things. As she got older, she happily took many opportunities to travel, though these were almost always related to church activities or with some other kind of charitable goal in mind. Case in point, a trip to Big Ugly Creek, West Virginia she took in her late teens, where she was part of a group that helped to repaint a community center. Despite her loving and giving spirit, Emily was no pushover. According to those close to her, she could be stubborn and would argue passionately if she thought she was right, especially when it came to her beliefs. She loved debating the religious principles of her Christian faith, and wasn't afraid to question things that she felt made no sense. Perhaps unsurprisingly, therefore, after graduating high school, Emily went off to pursue post-secondary education at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. It was here that she would major in philosophy, with the ultimate goal of becoming an Episcopal priest. In the fall of 2000, it seemed like Emily was well on her way to achieving this dream. She had just started her junior year, she was working hard, and she was still deeply involved in the church, particularly with the Episcopal Church's Youth Ministries Council. According to reports, her role with the council was preparing her for entering the priesthood. Sadly, none of this would ever come to fruition. You see, just when it looked like Emily Murray had everything in her life figured out, she would vanish without a trace. Just before midnight on November 3rd, 2000, Tom and Cynthia Murray were awoken by a phone call at their home in Cold Spring, New York. On the other end of the line was their daughter, Nikki, who sounded incredibly worried. They soon learned why when she uttered the words that are every parent's worst nightmare. Their youngest child, Emily, was missing. The whole thing had started earlier that morning, when Emily's roommates at Kenyon College, Megan and Kate, awoke to find that she wasn't in their dorm room. Immediately, the young women thought that this was strange. It wasn't like Emily not to come home. Still, they didn't sound the alarm right away for a couple of reasons. There had been the odd time in the past when Emily had pulled an all-nighter studying with friends at a neighboring dorm. On top of that, they knew that the previous evening was her last shift at the restaurant where she worked part-time, and some of the people there had been throwing her a little celebration. The roommates tried to go on with their days as usual. However, the situation nagged at them more and more as the hours passed. By that afternoon, they were starting to hear from other friends on campus that they hadn't seen Emily either. Things finally came to a head that evening when Emily failed to show up to a daiquiri party that they had all been planning. The roommates knew for a fact that the 20-year-old had planned to attend this. She had made a specific trip out to Walmart a couple of days earlier to buy a blender. With that, they contacted campus police to report their concerns. By the time Tom and Cynthia were told about their daughter's disappearance, nearly a full 24 hours had passed since she had last been seen. They, as well as Emily's siblings, began making desperate calls to anyone that they could think of that might know where she was. Disturbingly, no one seemed to have any idea. Within a couple of hours, the worried parents were on a plane to Ohio. When Tom and Cynthia arrived at Kenyon College, they were filled in on further details by campus police. They, as well as a team of dozens of volunteers, had scoured the campus and the surrounding area for Emily. But unfortunately, nothing had been found. This included her car, a green Subaru Outback, which was also missing. The Knox County Sheriff's Office, meanwhile, who by this time had taken over the investigation, seemed remarkably flippant about the whole situation. They apparently told Tom and Cynthia not to worry. Emily had probably gone on an impromptu trip to Cancun or something, they said. She'd be coming back after blowing off some steam and would apologize for causing so much anxiety. She was young. These things happened. Now, the Murrays did admit that sometimes their daughter could be spontaneous. Once, Emily had such a bad craving for her favorite pizza restaurant back in Shaker Heights, Captain Tony's, that she had jumped in her car and driven there without a second thought. She went an additional 40 miles out of her way to pick up a friend in the opposite direction in Columbus. By the time she returned to Gambier, the round trip was about 400 miles. That being said, what wasn't at all like Emily was failing to stay in communication. Not a day went by that she didn't call or send an email to her family, and she always made sure to tell those close to her where she was going. In addition to this, Emily's roommates pointed out that several important personal items of hers had been left behind in her dorm. Among these were an uncashed check and her wallet, which contained her ID and her credit and bank cards. This last detail finally seems to have convinced Knox County Police that something strange might be going on. After all, if Emily had been planning on going somewhere, how was she supposed to do that without any money? With that, they began to start retracing the 20-year-old's steps. They started with the last place that she had definitely been seen. As previously mentioned, Emily had a part-time job as a server at a restaurant. The place was a local pizza joint and bar called Pirates Cove, which was located just across the street from the main part of the Kenyon College campus. Just a side note here, the pictures you're seeing right now say the Gambier Grill because this is what the restaurant was later renamed to. Unfortunately, Google Maps and image results for this location only go back to about 2012, but this is the same building where the restaurant used to be. Anyway, the proximity of Pirates Cove to the campus, as well as its business hours, made it an ideal spot for college students. According to sources we came across, it was one of the only spots in town where you could reliably hang out really late with friends, since it stayed open until 2 a.m. most nights of the week. Of course, this also meant that it sometimes attracted a, let's say, seedier clientele. Apparently, it was well known amongst the female students at Kenyon College that Pirates Cove wasn't the kind of place you went by yourself. On the night before she was reported missing, so November 2nd, Emily had been working her last shift at Pirates Cove. The restaurant's reputation had nothing to do with this. Instead, she had apparently decided to quit because her coursework at school was getting more demanding, and she wanted to devote as much time as possible to her studies. As a result, some of her co-workers had decided to throw her a little goodbye celebration. This wasn't like a huge event or anything. I mean, after all, it wasn't like Emily was really supposed to be going anywhere. Most of these people would still see her on campus. However, she had made a lot of friends there who were sad to see her go. That night, a bunch of them and other friends had dropped in to spend time with her while she worked her closing shift, with people kind of dropping in and out all evening. Due to the casual nature of all of this, there was quite a long list of people that police needed to speak with. After gathering as many names as possible, they started conducting interviews with all of Emily's friends who had been at the Pirates Cove on November 2nd, as well as speaking with other staff who had been present that evening. Co-workers of Emily's in particular were able to give police a pretty good understanding of the timeline, especially towards the end of the night. At 2 a.m., the restaurant closed, and all of the remaining customers started to funnel out. At this point, Emily and several other staff members stayed behind to finish their closing duties. A fellow server and friend of the 20-year-olds, Olivia Gilly, said that she had last seen Emily when they split up to tackle cleaning tasks in different parts of the restaurant. She had started wiping down tables and vacuuming in the dining room, while Emily had headed off into the kitchen. This was confirmed by a cook at the restaurant, Greg McKnight. He said that they had all finished up about an hour later. Everyone agreed on one thing. No one had seen Emily after 3 a.m. This is when they all went home and assumed that she had done the same. After learning all of this, police now had what they felt was a solid timeline. Emily had disappeared somewhere in the early morning hours of November 3rd, after she had left Pirates Cove, but before her roommates woke up at their dorm room. The question now was obvious. What had happened during this crucial window of time? Well, authorities were about to receive some new leads. Unfortunately, it would send them in multiple different directions. Because of the slow start to the investigation into Emily Murray's disappearance, several days had already passed by the time police had established a basic outline of the case. Though this had resulted in a lot of information being uncovered, detectives were still split on what had actually happened to the 20-year-old. Specifically, some on the investigative team were hesitant to give up the idea that Emily had gone missing of her own accord. This was especially true once they unearthed troubling new details about her mental health. Investigators learned that Emily had struggled a lot with depression in the past couple of years. She had always been the kind of person who felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but things had become amplified as her schoolwork, schedule, and life in general became more and more demanding. Heartbreakingly, this had resulted in 2 attempts to take her own life. The most recent incident had taken place in May of 2000, just a few months before her disappearance. She had taken 75 Tylenol tablets, though thankfully first responders had been called to her dorm room and were able to save her life. The whole thing had coincided with the end of a relationship with a boyfriend of Emily's, named Adam. When detectives looked at notebooks found in Emily's dorm room after her disappearance, they found writings that they felt could indicate a similar state of mind. They wondered if maybe the 20-year-old had harmed herself, and that this is why her car was gone, but all of her other personal items had been left behind. Tom, Cynthia, and the rest of the Murray family rejected this theory and tried to explain that Emily's behavior in the lead-up to her disappearance wasn't at all the same as when she had previously struggled with depression. Before, she had cut herself off from the family and had been extremely withdrawn. In the days prior to being reported missing, Emily had been in contact just like usual and had shared excited updates with her parents about things that were happening at school. She was also looking forward to coming home for the upcoming Thanksgiving holidays. Cynthia and Tom said Emily had gotten treatment after the last time she had struggled with her mental health, and overall seemed to be doing really well. Once again, though, authorities weren't sure. They talked to friends of Emily's who said that they were pretty sure she had gone off her medication shortly before disappearing. That week, several people also said she had seemed slightly irritable and not like herself. Understandably, foul play was the other major theory that was looked into. Even though they hadn't found any direct evidence of this yet, some members of the investigative team were convinced enough that they reached out to the FBI and the state's Bureau of Criminal Investigation for assistance. They reasoned that if Emily were the victim of a kidnapping, it was possible she had been taken across state lines. Of course, there were also suspects a lot closer to home as well. For starters, detectives questioned Emily's ex-boyfriend, Adam. He likely would have been a person of interest no matter what due to his romantic connection with the 20-year-old. However, police took an especially keen interest in him after learning that he had attended Emily's celebration her last night at Pirates Cove. In fact, multiple witnesses claimed they'd seen them together. During their conversation, Adam appeared calm. He said that he had fallen for Emily after they had a bunch of classes together, and eventually they started dating. They cared for each other a lot, but the situation between them was often turbulent. It wasn't abusive or anything. He said they just weren't a good match for one another. Adam admitted that he was at Pirates Cove until closing time that night, but said that he left along with the other customers. He said that he had no idea what had happened to Emily after that. Detectives were still suspicious of Adam, but his alibi seemed to check out, so they moved on. Authorities next turned their attention to two of Emily's male co-workers at Pirates Cove. Their names were David Cale and Dave Yoakum. David Cale was a driver and cashier for the restaurant and became a person of interest after staff at the business said that they thought he had a thing for Emily. David was also one of the older employees at the restaurant, and detectives wondered if maybe he was interested in Emily but she had turned him down. When questioned, though, David claimed that his feelings for Emily were purely platonic. They chatted a lot at work, yes, but that was it. People had seen him talking to her on the night of her disappearance because he had gone out of his way to wish her all the best, he said. Unlike a lot of the other staff members, he wasn't a student at Kenyon College, so he knew this might be the last time he would see Emily. David also said that he left the restaurant early that night. He was gone by 11 because he had tickets to a concert. Authorities looked into this, and David's alibi checked out. The situation with Dave Yoakum, on the other hand, was a lot more unsettling. Apparently, he had actually been fired from Pirates Cove for repeatedly harassing his female colleagues. According to several members of staff, Dave was the kind of guy who just couldn't take a hint no matter how many times he was told somebody wasn't interested in him. On top of this, he apparently made non-stop crude and suggestive remarks that irritated everyone. A number of people said that Dave had finally been fired after making unwanted advances that were so creepy, one of the cooks, Greg McKnight, had to step in. Police looked further into Dave Yoakum, though no one had actually seen him at Pirates Cove on the night Emily went missing. Detectives theorized that it was possible that he had staked out the restaurant and waited for the 20-year-old to leave. However, he also had an alibi that seemed to check out. Unfortunately, after this, the investigation really started to stall. There was no real evidence to speak of, and in the minds of detectives, they were being pulled in two equally plausible directions in terms of their theories of the case. In the meantime, opinions were also split on the campus of Kenyon College. Like some members of the investigative team, many couldn't and didn't want to believe that Emily was the victim of a crime. In the absence of concrete information, rumors swirled everywhere. Some said that she couldn't hack it at school and had jumped in her car and headed home. Others speculated that she ran off to start a new life. A few said that they believed she'd checked herself into a mental institution. Still, the longer this went on, the harder it was to believe that there was an innocent explanation for Emily's disappearance. As days turned into weeks, a sense of fear gripped the Kenyon College campus, which by now was littered with missing persons flyers for Emily. School officials advised that students travel everywhere in pairs, and advertised that school security could be called to provide escorts across campus after dark. While this was all very unsettling, Emily's friends and fellow students at Kenyon were far from the only ones stuck in this constant state of dread. Tom, Cynthia, and the rest of the 20-year-old's family were living in a constant nightmare. They couldn't eat, they couldn't sleep, and they certainly couldn't go on with daily life. In fact, even taking part in the search effort posed an impossible dilemma. What happened if Emily called them at their home in New York and they weren't there to pick up the phone? This unbearable situation would last for more than 5 weeks, until finally authorities got a break. Even then, it came from the most unexpected place. It was a massive coincidence that would end up blowing the case wide open. On October 11th, 2000, so nearly a month before Emily Murray went missing, a man named Ronald Hopkins was driving his truck on the outskirts of the community of Ray in Vinton County, Ohio. He was traveling down Clark Road when suddenly he was struck by another vehicle. At first, the crash didn't seem like that big of a deal. Ronald wasn't hurt, and he immediately recognized the man behind the wheel of the other vehicle as one of his neighbors. The damage also wasn't as bad as it could have been. A lot of it was to the car that the other man had been driving. In fact, the force of the collision had popped open the man's trunk. However, all of this quickly changed when another neighbor, James Clary, stopped at the scene to offer some help. While walking around the crash site, James noticed the open trunk of the car. Inside were several guns, ones that he recognized had just been stolen from his house in a recent break-in. The police were called, and the driver of the car was arrested. Fast forward nearly 2 months later, to December 9th, 2000, when a pair of deputies were sent out to serve court papers informing the driver from the October crash that he had been indicted on charges of complicity to commit burglary and receiving stolen property. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, when the deputies arrived at this man's address, which was listed as a trailer on a piece of land just off of Clark Road, they were initially not very hopeful. The secluded wooded property did not look like it had been cared for in some time. In fact, there was junk scattered all over, as well as several vehicles in varying states of disrepair. It was not surprising, therefore, when knocks at the trailer door went unanswered. The officers were just getting ready to leave when they noticed something that was kind of tucked behind the trailer. It was another vehicle. However, this one was not like the others on the property. For one thing, it looked relatively new. For another, it had New York license plates on it. The vehicle was a green Subaru Outback station wagon. The vehicle stuck out so much that the Vinton County deputies decided to run the plates. They came back as belonging to a missing woman, 20-year-old Emily Murray. When Vinton County authorities relayed this information to the BCI and to detectives with the Knox County Sheriff's Office, this wasn't the only surprise, though. What also immediately caught their attention was who owned that trailer property where Emily's car had been found. It was the cook at Pirates Cove, 24-year-old Greg McKnight. Understandably, this was a bombshell revelation on its own. However, things would only speed up from here. After learning that it was Emily's car on Greg's property, police obtained a search warrant for the trailer there. An officer entered through a window, and upon climbing in began clearing the residence. As soon as he did, he was hit with an unmistakable and stomach-churning odor. When more investigators were led inside, it wasn't long before more disturbing discoveries were made. There was dried blood in various places in the trailer, including one spot where it had clearly pooled in the living room. Ominously, there were also smears in the blood that looked like drag marks. Police learned why when they headed into one of the trailer's bedrooms, where it was obvious that that strong odor they had smelled before was emanating from. Tragically, rolled up in a rug inside the room was the body of Emily Murray. An autopsy would reveal that she had died from a single contact gunshot wound to the right side of her head. Understandably, the news of Emily's death, after 36 excruciating days, was an unfathomable blow to her family. It also stunned her friends, classmates, co-workers, and the community at large. Regardless of the rumors, everyone had hoped that she would be found alive and well. In the following days, grief and heartbreak quickly rippled out in all directions. Nearly 1,000 people showed up to attend a memorial for the 20-year-old in Shaker Heights, despite a snowstorm. Hundreds more attended a ceremony on the campus of Kenyon College a month later, where a tree was planted in Emily's honor. After the discovery of Emily's body, Greg McKnight was immediately brought in for questioning. To say that he was unhelpful would be a serious understatement. He gave non-committal and one-word answers to almost every question he was asked, and as soon as he was confronted with what detectives knew, he stopped talking altogether and asked for an attorney.
You're living over, what's the name of that street? Did you have any other property at any point?
Yes.
Where was that? What kind of structure is down there now?
Trailer.
When did you say the last time that you were down there?
Okay, I'm down there on the 4th. 4th of December. Okay.
Emily disappeared the Friday morning, the 3rd?
The 3rd of November.
Right. Would there be any way that she would know where that place? I mean, she never followed you down there, and we never took her down there. Right. Greg, I don't think you're being 100% truthful with us. We've been down to the property.
Okay.
Greg, we've got BCI agents at the property right now.
You know what BCI is? Okay, it's the Bureau of Criminal Identification Investigation. Okay, they're from the Attorney General's office, and they're crime scenes. Very good at what they do.
I don't know if things got out of hand or what, but we've got to have an explanation.
Fortunately, this didn't really matter. Since Greg was already wanted in connection with that burglary case, he was able to be held even before charges were brought in the Emily Murray case. In the meantime, detectives and BCI agents went into overdrive, scouring the trailer property for further clues. In addition to the large amount of blood evidence in the trailer, DNA from which would later be matched to Emily, authorities soon found other vital clues. There was a hole in the subfloor of the trailer near the largest pool of blood in the living room, and a spent shell casing was found nearby. It was theorized that this was from the gunshot that had killed Emily. To the frustration of investigators, the actual bullet could not be located despite extensive searches of the ground underneath the trailer, though they were able to find several other rounds that had been fired into trees on the property, presumably as target practice. These bullets were a match to the spent shell casing found in the trailer, as well as additional shell casings found in the residence. It was also determined that this caliber of round was consistent with the fatal injuries Emily had suffered. Unfortunately, as devastating as all of this already was, it wasn't the end just yet. You see, there was still one final, awful secret left to uncover. Several days into the search at Greg McKnight's trailer, detectives and agents with the BCI released another surprise announcement in connection with the Emily Murray case. They had now discovered the remains of a second person on the property. While sources we came across contradicted each other about exactly how the discovery was made, the most frequently cited version of events goes like this. So, after finding Emily's body in the trailer and processing that scene, investigators began to spread out on the property, which was about 2 acres in size, and look for additional clues. Specifically, they were hoping to find the murder weapon and began to search for any spot that looked like it might make a good hiding place. Eventually, they stumbled across a concrete water cistern that was partially buried in the ground. When they brought in an excavator to scoop out the water, the second bucket came back containing what were clearly human bones. Over the next 6 days, more bones and teeth would be found in the cistern, as well as in a root cellar and in garbage bags that were scattered on the property. Also in these bags were tennis shoes, overalls, and a pair of men's boxer shorts. These, as well as the remains, showed signs of having been partially burned. Though the state of these remains made them much more challenging to identify than Emily's. Soon, authorities caught another lucky break when they learned about a missing 20-year-old man named Gregory Julius. Gregory had been reported missing about 6 months earlier from the nearby city of Chillicothe. Investigators reached back out to the woman who made that report, Gregory's girlfriend, Dana Bostic. She confirmed that the last time she had seen her boyfriend was on May 12th, when he went out to attend an Ohio State University block party with a friend. That friend was Greg McKnight. Dana told police that 2 days later, Greg McKnight came over saying that he had no idea where Gregory was. He claimed that he went off with some different friends at the last second in Cincinnati. Dana said she felt weird about this story at the time because Greg couldn't seem to answer any of the questions about where they had gone or what they had been doing on the night of May 12th. He also claimed that he didn't know which friends Gregory had been with. At first, she thought maybe Gregory had left her, but when he never returned to grab any of his belongings or even his ID, she started to think that something was wrong. She reported him missing in June. When Dana was shown articles of the burned clothing that had been found on Greg McKnight's property, she identified them as the same clothes that Gregory had been wearing on the last day that he was seen alive. On top of the already incriminating evidence found against Greg McKnight, by this point, investigators had also learned that this was far from the only time he'd been in trouble with the law. In 1992, at the age of 15, he had been convicted of murder for killing a Columbus man during the middle of a robbery. Once again, sources contradict each other here, but he was released either 5 or 6 years later after serving time at the Circleville Youth Center. With authorities realizing that they were arguably dealing with a serial killer, they decided to move ahead with charges against Greg McKnight for the murders of both Emily Murray and Gregory Julius. Prosecutors decided that they were going to try and seek the death penalty. Now, this decision was a controversial one, though not for the reason you might expect. Initially, the judge in the case decided that Vinton County could not afford to try a death penalty case. He argued that the county, which was the poorest and least populated in the state, did not have the financial resources to pay the cost of Greg McKnight's defense, as well as the many appeals that would almost certainly follow. However, after public outrage and a higher court ruling, the judge ended up overturning his own decision. When the trial finally began in 2002, the prosecution had a lot of witnesses and evidence on their side. They argued that Greg had secretly harbored feelings for Emily Murray, and that when he found out she was leaving Pirates Cove, he knew her last shift would be his last opportunity to act on them. After closing up at the restaurant, he followed Emily outside and asked her for a ride. Almost everyone who police spoke with stated that Emily would have thought nothing of this, and almost certainly would have agreed. Prosecutors alleged that Greg had taken advantage of this and had kidnapped Emily. He couldn't take her to the place where he lived in Gambier because his wife was there, so instead, he drove her to his second property, that secluded trailer 100 miles away in Vinton County. Once there, when it became clear that Emily wasn't going to cooperate, Greg shot and killed her. The case with Gregory Julius was understandably more difficult because there were fewer witnesses to what had happened. Luckily, though, by this time investigators had uncovered additional evidence. Specifically, police had been able to track down a red Mazda that Greg McKnight had been driving around the time of Gregory's disappearance, one which he had sold almost immediately afterwards. Though the back seat of the vehicle had been replaced, analysis of the car uncovered blood in the carpet underneath. It was a DNA match to Gregory Julius. As for the reason Greg McKnight had killed Gregory, prosecutors said that they couldn't say for sure. From what they had uncovered, though, it seemed to be entirely trivial. An argument either about a girl or drugs, they alleged. Clearly aware that they were up against a mountain of evidence, Greg's defense team focused a lot of their attention on attacking Emily's character. According to those that knew her, they did this by zeroing in on her mental health issues, as well as twisting facts about her life to make it look like she might be responsible for her own death. They made Emily out to be a wild child, one with tattoos and a love for staying out all night and partying. As previously mentioned, though, the only time Emily stayed out all night was to study for school, and her one tattoo was a Holy Spirit dove, which she had gotten as a testament to her faith. Understandably, listening to this was agony for Tom and Cynthia. Tom would later go on to say in an interview, quote, "I was in a primal rage at the trial, not at McKnight, but at his lawyers, who took everything sweet and honest Emily ever did and tried to make it sound sordid. I wouldn't be surprised if there are marks in the bench where I dug my fingers in. The things they said about Emily were pointless, irrelevant, and cruel. I had to sit in the same room as they vilified her, and I couldn't do anything because I did not want to cause a mistrial." Still, as heartbreaking and painful as all of this was, Tom and Cynthia sat through every minute of that trial. Much to their relief, when it was all over, the jury sided with the prosecution. Greg McKnight was convicted of aggravated murder for the killing of Emily and first-degree murder for killing Gregory, as well as kidnapping and aggravated robbery. Even after everything they had been through, when it came down to it, Emily's family still stuck to their principles. Tom and Cynthia had always been against the death penalty, and they knew that their daughter felt particularly strong about it. As a result, they went before the judge at Greg McKnight's sentencing, asking that his life be spared. They also issued a statement that read in part, quote, "Emily would regard it as a tragedy and an abomination if another human being were put to death in her name." Despite Tom and Cynthia's plea, the judge decided to sentence Greg McKnight to death anyway. Ultimately, though, because of the way these cases work, it seems that the family may get their wish in the end. Like in many states, currently the future of the death penalty is uncertain in Ohio. At the time of this recording, it's been nearly 6 years since the last person was put to death. It's now been more than 20 years since Greg McKnight's conviction, and he currently remains on death row. I know some of you are probably tired of hearing me say this at the ends of these cases, but I really felt awful for Emily Murray and her family while working on this video. There's not always a ton of information about the victims in the stories that we cover. Case in point, Gregory Julius. Honestly, I'm sad that there wasn't more that we could find to share with you about his life. In Emily's case, though, I feel like I really started to get a sense of who she was as I was reading about her life. There's no doubt in my mind that if she had been given the chance, she would have gone on to do great things. And that's what's truly gutting about all of this. In a similar vein, I really grew to admire Emily's family over the course of the research for this story. There's no right way or playbook for handling an unbelievable tragedy like this. But I honestly don't know if I could muster even an ounce of the resiliency, thoughtfulness, or strength that they showed throughout this devastating process. Particularly in the way that Tom and Cynthia refused to let this break them as a family. The couple knew that they were fighting against the odds. The death of a child under any circumstances has the potential to destroy marriages, relationships, and lives. But by all accounts, they dealt with their grief together as a family. According to reports, Tom and Cynthia celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary around the time of Greg McKnight's conviction, and said that they were doing whatever they could to keep each other and the rest of the family close. As for where the case stands today, as you might imagine, Greg McKnight is still trying to appeal. So far, the convictions have been upheld all the way to the state Supreme Court. However, as recently as 2020, motions were still being filed. In the latest of these appeals, McKnight is claiming that he didn't get a fair trial because of the all-white jury who convicted him. There are further allegations that racial slurs were repeatedly used by jury members during deliberations, which, if true, could lead to some potentially sticky situations for the state. While it's been almost 4 years since the latest publicly available update, I'm definitely not going to pretend I know what will happen next, especially considering what happened with last week's case that was reopened after 10 years without any real news. What I can promise you, though, is that if there are any major developments, we'll be sure to let you know. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.